It's a pleasure to welcome Frederic Sansoz from University of Vermont here today. He's a professor of mechanical engineering and materials science. He has a bachelor's degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering and a master's degree in materials science and engineering from the École Nationale Supérieure de Mécanique and Aerospace, I think, in France. His PhD with honors, he graduated from materials science and engineering in École de Mines in France in 2000. He was a postdoctoral fellow in mechanical engineering at Johns Hopkins University until 2003. And I believe he's been at University of Vermont since then, and in 2008 received the National Science Foundation Career Award. His research focuses on understanding the mechanics and physics of interface-dominated nanomaterials and materials theory, atomic computer simulations, and nanoscale experiments. So it's a real pleasure to have him come today. I understand he was here once before, but almost a decade or more ago. So hopefully we'll have some updates since then. And I know he's had some good conversations with our materials science faculty, and it's a pleasure to welcome you today. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invitation for giving this seminar at Dartmouth. It's always a pleasure to come here. It's exciting. I see you have a celebration. It's 150 years of engineering, and organizing these seminars means so much for us in northern New England because we don't get to see a lot of speakers, and so Dartmouth has been always leading these seminar series, and I always send my own students to Dartmouth to go and see those seminars. So today I want to focus my talk on an area of research that has seen a lot of new developments in the past 5-6 years. I will be talking about the mechanics of nanoscale metals. And so to start my presentation, I want to explain a little bit more what are those nanoscale metals and the different type of metals that falls into this category. And so one excellent example right now in terms of research is to look at silver nanowires. And the reason for that is because it's totally amazing how fast we are going from new discoveries to application just by taking a metal like silver, but looking at very, very small wires of silvers. And so to illustrate what I'm saying here, I want to just go through a list of important discoveries that have been made with silver nanowires. And then I will show how they can directly impact us in the very near future. And so, silver is a very interesting metal because it has the highest electrical conductivity. And so, one advance that has been made in 2010 is the production of films of network of silver nanowires. And because they are nanowires, they enable the light to go through, and so they are totally transparent. Now, mechanically, because they are networks, they can also be deformed without breaking. And so what we find here are a new type of conducting electron material that has high electrical conductivity, that is transparent, and at the same time doesn't break, can be bent, can be stretched to very high deformation. So that's very exciting. And then there's more discoveries. The second paper here in 2013 shows actually what we call the smallest silver nano pillar. And so basically, if you go down to a certain limit, imagine your wires are grown as filament on a substrate. If they are made in such a way, they can actually get glued together in some way. So what this paper has achieved here is finding the proper length and size, so they never glue together. So they really have separate features. And so imagine like a carpet floor where all the fibers of the carpet are perfectly straight. And that's actually very hard to do. So they managed to make this nano carpet out of silver nanowires. So that's something that can be exploited in devices. And then when we reduce even more the size, so if we talk about silver nanocrystals, then we start to discover new, totally exotic properties that we didn't know existed a few years ago. So for instance, 2014, in Nature Materials, there was a publication showing that when you compress single nanoparticle of silver in situ inside a transmission electron where they hopefully look like they behave like liquid. And that is because the surface is so large at this scale that the atoms on the surface are going to diffuse without producing any plasticity in the core of the particle. So this is called a liquid-like behavior for a material that is just a pure metal. So this is very, very new here. So now, real-world application here. So silver nanowires, when they are represented on a chart, so this represents the electrical conductivity of the material versus the cost for producing the material. The current technology relies mostly in the transparent electrode in the indium tin oxide, the ITO, okay? And we see actually those silver nanowire network, they perform better and at a lower cost. So that's attractive. But there's more to this. These materials can be very stretchable as opposed to these ITO displays, for instance, that are extremely brittle. So application of the silver nanowires network of films is, for instance, for sensors or touchscreen displays. So you can imagine that the touchscreen of your smartphone now could be produced with this technology on a much larger scale. So imagine, for instance, large screen that would be touchscreen displays, okay? And so what has been enabled here is because now we can deform this film of wires easily, as opposed to ITO. We can use processes like rolling to produce larger displays, okay? So for instance, this company in California, C3 Nano, make large displays already out of silicon nanowires, silver nanowires. Another area that is very important for energy application are solar cells. And so one issue with solar cells is to make them less brittle and hard and make them flexible. So in terms of the material for the photovoltaics, there are already materials that can achieve that. But the fundamental issue in these devices is also the electrode. So the electrode that will conduct the current from the photovoltaic material, these ones are not flexible very easily, okay? So the idea is to replace these electrodes by those silver nanowire network and makes truly flexible solar cell for application. And here comes more exotic properties. So Mesoglue is a startup company in Boston that was created a few years ago. And so they exploit this silver carpet, nanopillar on a carpet to glue, or as a soldering glue that can bond devices at room temperature. And that is so important for making these electrical devices because now you no longer require heat. And that means now you can use different type of substrates that are less, that are more sensitive to temperature with this type of mesoglue, okay? And so again, here they exploit the fact that at a very small scale, these metals become liquid-like and can bond together like a glue, okay? So these are really interesting applications. So my talk will focus mostly on the material science and the mechanics of the wires made in this film, and also other type of films. So usually the wires have a perfectly crystalline structure. But they are not always perfect, okay? And so one type of defect that is found in metallic nanowires or nanoscale metals is a type of coherent grain boundary, which is a twin boundary. And here are just examples for gold nanowires. So these are very thin nanowires produced in 3 different ways, showing the occurrence of those twin boundaries. Okay, so this is a large wires here by electrodeposition. These ones are made by chemistry, and you see those little lines here represent those tiny interfaces. Okay, now what's very specific about the interfaces here, they are coherent, and that's very important for properties. So in material science, in the textbook, these twin boundaries are not new. And so I will explain here that another class of nanoscale metal, aside from nanowires, are what we call nanotwin metals. So nanotwin metals in particular, they are metals that will include grain boundaries and grains. And those grains will contain a very high density of twin boundaries. So they contain nanotwins. And they are much larger than the nanowires. Okay, so another class of nanoscale metals I will discuss here are those nanotwin metals. And an example of where you can apply nanotwin metals for energy applications is shown here. So that's an example where you take a nanotwin copper material, like this one, and it's exposed to radiation. So similar to the environment you will have in a nuclear power plant. And so the aging of the material in those applications result from the formation of defects, stacking faults. And so this is an example of a defect that could form from radiation. And so what this shows is the twin planes that are shown on the images here will absorb the defect very rapidly as soon as they are formed. So we can imagine that using a nanotwin copper film, for instance, could be used as a structural material with a much larger lifetime in those applications because they can really absorb a large amount of defect forming by radiation. All right, so the ultimate goal here is simple. I'm more of a mechanical engineer, so I'm interested in strength. So the goal is really to increase the strength, but also the ductility of the material, but without changing the other important properties, and for instance, the electrical conductivity. So that's kind of what we want to achieve as an engineer. And scientifically, what it means is that we need to understand the basic mechanism of plastic deformation and strength as a function of size. Okay, so size effect here is the critical factor that we need to study fundamentally in order to achieve the ultimate goal. So to achieve that, unfortunately, we deal with nanoscale metal. It is very extremely difficult to characterize those materials because they are extremely small. And so this is an area where computational simulation and experiment have to work together to obtain these results, all right? And so I like to call this the handshake between experiment and atomistic modeling. So in my talk today, I will present just an application of this principle because we are using experimental and computational approaches to solve or to characterize the mechanical behavior of the nanoscale metal. And so we use in situ nanomechanics, which consists in breaking or testing mechanically material inside a high-resolution transmission microscope. We use also scanning X-ray diffraction to characterize the behavior. And this is just not sufficient. If you really want to understand fundamentally what happened, you also have to perform a molecular dynamic simulation. And we actually have to use even large-scale molecular dynamic simulation using supercomputers to achieve these results. So my talk today will illustrate this approach on 3 studies that we published in the past few years. So I'll be discussing first about bulk nanoscale metals. That is, materials that are containing nanotwin in large densities. And then I will move on to the small-scale nanometals with nanowires. So in parallel to my talk today, I just want to emphasize something that is these works are enabled by collaboration. And so this also illustrates how it is important to collaborate with experimentalists in particular. So I see there's a lot of graduate students in this room today. And so let me just tell you a couple of anecdotes, which actually are important for the graduate students. So when I was a postdoc at Johns Hopkins about 15 years ago, I was attending seminars, and in the same room, I had two friends who were graduate students at Johns Hopkins who also were attending the same seminar. And those two friends are listed in this paper. They are Maurice Wang and Ryan Ott. And without knowing it, we were working pretty much on the same thing, but we were from different groups. So we never really worked together for about 10 years. And one day we just happened to meet at a conference. They are both working at national laboratories now. And we just found out that we were actually working on the same thing, except they are experimentalists, and I'm more of a theorist and computational scientist. So we realized we were working on the same thing, but using different technique. And so the first paper here is a result of this collaboration. And so I really like to stress the fact that the friends you have during grad school, the network you make in grad school is extremely important. This is what really is going to help you in the future, and you don't even know it yet. So that's an example here. And then the other example of how collaboration can help you succeed. In this case, I was presenting a purely fundamental and computational study on the effect of twins in nanowires. And in the room, I remember presenting at the MRS conference in Boston, somebody raised his hand and says, well, Frederic, I think in my lab we make these materials. We just don't know what are their properties, but they look exactly what you are showing in the simulation. And we were just making prediction. There was no real material made yet. And so what happened is we worked together, made some tests, and that's basically the result of the second publication, and more recently the third one here. So again, in parallel of the science here, I think it's very important that the collaboration can enable new discoveries in this field of nanoscale science. All right, so let me start first with the team that I call the bulk team. We are trying here to make material that represent a thick film. Typically, they can be up to 1 millimeter in thickness. So it's not no longer a film, it's more like a coating, but they contain grains full of nanotwins here. And the goal is really to obtain very high strength film. So this is the work, the first work that has been published already more than 10 years ago about the first nanotwin copper film in science. And so here what people have described in the literature for a very long time, for almost a decade, these interfaces are perfectly coherent. And so they produce much higher mechanical strength than the typical metals. So in particular, when you decrease the twin size, that is the spacing between two twin boundaries, and we find a large hardening behavior. But to a certain limit, beyond that, the material becomes softer. Okay, and that was strange at the time. Okay, but this is just about the strength here. Another thing that's very characteristic about nanotwin metals is this. Imagine you make a metal by reducing simply the grain size. You'll find that this metal will have an increased strength. It's a hole patch effect. But at the same time, the ductility drops dramatically. Okay, and this is the behavior you find in this blue curve here. When you decrease the grain size D, the ductility drops dramatically. So basically, it's a high strength but more brittle material. Right? And for application, engineering application, that's not great. These nanotwin metals, they show a totally different behavior. When you decrease now the twin size in the system, actually the ductility increases. So it's kind of a miracle material where you have both the strength and the ductility that's being controlled and enhanced by the twin size. So what we're trying to understand is the mechanism behind that. So there are basically two types of theories to explain this abnormal behavior. One relies simply on the nucleation of dislocation from perfect twin boundaries. And so we can predict some Hall-Page type behavior here. And in this softening, it's now understood that twin can also nucleate dislocation from that junction with the Graham boundary. So it's just a dislocation-based model. And then more recently, experimentally, it was observed that, in fact, there are size effects in the stress concentration near the interfaces here. So this is an experimental work. And what they found is these stress concentration actually depend on the twin size. So that could possibly be another mechanism by which we see those size effects. Now, there are two problems in this comparison here. The first one is when you look at the grain sizes that are typically used in experiments, they are almost 10 times larger than the grain sizes we use in MD simulation to predict those mechanisms. So there's always a disconnect between the simulation and the experiment. And these mechanisms explain the increase in strength, but they don't clearly explain why the ductility changes so dramatically. And so what governs truly the ductility of nanotwin metals? Again, these materials are assumed to be perfect in the sense that the boundaries inside are perfect. So here comes the team with my colleague Maurice Wang and Ryan Hott. So one is working at Lawrence Livermore National Lab and the other at Ames Laboratory. And so we use these materials that are called columnar grain nanotwin copper, which have a grain structure that looks like a column. And the twins here are oriented parallel to the axis of the grain. And so mechanically, they are very interesting because we can isolate the mechanism by simply changing the orientation of the loading direction. So for instance, if I compress or apply a nano indentation to the film, in this case, I will nucleate dislocation that will be blocked by the interface. Okay. Now, if I shear the film in some way, in this case, we create those dislocation that create some detwinning that cause the softening we saw in the previous slide. All right. And then the more practical test is actually to take the film and simply perform a tensile test on the film. In this case, well, what you expect to produce is it's called a threading partial. It's like the dislocation that run parallel to the direction of the film. And it turns out that based on theory, if there's nothing blocking the dislocation, the twin boundary in this case, they play no role. They just, the threading dislocation just go through the material, all right? So we took this approach and we look at this from first molecular dynamics simulations. And so in the case of a threading partial, what I want to show here is this dislocation, they nucleate, they travel through the grain, and they disappear on the other side. So I don't know if you can dim the light a little bit. I will show you the video. There are two grain boundaries on this video. The red lines represent the twin boundaries. So what you're going to see in this movie are dislocation that nucleate on one side, travel through the grain, disappear on the other side. They are totally absorbed by the next grain. Okay? So it's going to be pretty fast. Okay, one came here, another one came here. So I should explain also that these tiny dots represent individual atoms. The empty space there actually does not exist. What we did in the simulation, in the visualization, we remove the face center cubic atom so we can see the dislocation and the interfaces. So I'm only showing the defect in this simulation. But clearly, as I deform this system, I do not produce more new dislocation. They just nucleate, travel, and disappear on the other side. No accumulation of dislocation. So that's the first conclusion, if you assume this interface to be perfect. So the experimentalists, they did the same. And now they use in situ nanomechanics. So the first test is to look at a synchrotron X-ray diffraction experiment where we make a film. This is a kind of a close-up view of the film. We stretch the film, and at the same time, we expose the film to high-energy X-rays. And that gives us information about the way the crystal plane deform elastically inside the crystal in real time. All right. And so what we found at the time was very abnormal. typically in this type of experiment, you will see that the lattice strain deviation evolve with a monotonic fashion. Either it keeps increasing or decrease all the time, but never change in the middle of the deformation. So here, for instance, these represent the lattice strain deviation measured from this X-ray diffraction. And we see this behavior that's totally abnormal, where, for instance, on the 200 plane, the curve goes down, but then there's a reversal in the direction here. Same for this 111 direction, but not for the other direction, okay? And so we compare that to the actual stress you apply to the film, and we see that this behavior occurs well past the stress of the material. So it's somewhere in the ductility regime of the material, all right? So what that suggests is there are more than one mechanism in competition in this problem. It's not just pure dislocation nucleation. Something else is happening that explains this change in the X-ray diffraction here. All right, and then another thing we observe is we look at the width of the peak in the X-ray diffraction, and so typically that width corresponds to any internal strain or accumulation of dislocation you have. In this case, we find a significant increase in the internal strain in the film. That means that some dislocation are accumulated. See, and that's totally different from what the simulation have predicted before. Simulation predict no accumulation. So something is wrong here. That's how we started this study. Another thing that was totally awkward is when we do post-mortem analysis of the thin films in a TEM, we find grains that are totally detwined. There's no twin anymore. And the only way this can happen is by shearing the grain. But we did not apply any shear. It was pure tension. And again, something abnormal happened in this observation. So again, how to solve this problem require some very special resources. And Maurice Wang in particular has access to a new technology that enables you to do crystallographic analysis on a very small scale, nanoscale. So this is called an IPFOM, the inverse pole figure orientation mapping inside a high resolution TEM. And so it gives you these pictures. It's a cross-section of one of the grain, a nanotwin grain. And the colors shows the crystal orientation. Right. So if you had a conventional transmission electron microscope, you will see those grain boundary with perfect flat features, okay? Now this picture here, each pixel is a single X-ray diffraction experiment. It includes about 250,000 of these in this picture. And at the time, it took about 7 days to obtain that one picture, all right? But from each pixel, we get exactly the crystal orientation on below a nanoscale resolution. And by using this special technique, what we achieve is we found that these perfect twin boundaries are actually not that perfect. They do contain tiny defects that look like tiny steps and that are far bigger than the resolution of the image here. So they can be on the order of 1 to 3 nanometers. So it totally redefines the way we think of the nanotwin materials and the twin boundaries as perfect coherent boundaries. They actually are defective interfaces on the very nanoscale. Okay? And so this information was extremely important for me because I could redesign my atomistic simulation to include those defects. And so this is an example where we have the twin boundary here, and we included one of those step defects, and we call them kink step because they look like kink. And then we made larger model with a lot of them, and we just repeated the same simulation. And the results are totally different now when we have the presence of the defect. So without defects, the perfect twin actually predicts from simulation a decrease in the dislocation density. Okay, so that's consistent with the fact that we don't accumulate new dislocation. And as soon as they introduce those very tiny defects along the twin boundary, each case shows that we increase the density of dislocation. So that's consistent with the X-ray diffraction experiment showing the accumulation of dislocation. All right, so let me show you some videos that will illustrate some new deformation mechanism that result from the introduction of those kink defects. So this one, we have a film, and we pull in this direction. The defect, you see, you have a twin boundary here. There's a defect here. It's a kink. And then we have two grain boundary here. And so what you will see here, there's a dislocation that try to nucleate, another one here. And then at some point they're going to travel. But when they travel, they leave some debris. Those defects actually bind those dislocations at different locations, right? And then it becomes very complicated. Even some defects start to move, migrate, even though we never applied any shear to it. So it's a much more complex picture to the deformation mechanism as soon as you introduce very tiny defects to the twin boundaries. And in this case, we simply shear a different model. And you'll see that these defects have their own mechanics, the small scale mechanics they have. They will just migrate very easily. And again, this was not predicted from the assumption that we have perfect twin boundaries. Yes?
We're looking at complete lattice dislocations, not the partial dislocations associated with boundary.
I don't get your question.
Share a twin with the passage of partials.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what's going on here.
So these are the pre-existing twin boundaries. So they are stacking fault, okay? And so these are just defects along the stacking fault. So we're not creating new dislocation in the pure shear model. The defects are just migrating naturally along the plane of the twin boundary. So they are not new lattice dislocation, okay? So there is definitely a new mechanics associated with that. And so again, to illustrate that, this is the example of the first movie where we compare before and then after deformation. And so, for instance, these have disappeared, so there's total migration of the defects. In some other location here, what's noted as L represents the formation of a Lomer lock. And the Lomer lock actually is responsible for much of the hardening in conventional metals. Again, these are things that you could not predict by assuming that the twin boundary is a perfect interface. Okay, so truly they are defective. So more recently, we have with my student at University of Vermont, we've looked at the tiny detail of the mechanics when you introduce a defect. In particular, when you have dislocation intersecting a kink defect. In this category, you have two types: either the dislocation is directly the kink, or it has a 60-degree angle, so it's called a 60-degree intersection. So we've used atomistic simulation to study that in detail. And this is just one example to show you how the defect can impact the mechanical behavior. So we introduce a dislocation, it's a screw dislocation. And you see the twin boundary is here, so we have two grain. And basically in the simulation, we force the dislocation to pass through the twin. And by cross-slip, we'll go to the next grain here. So this is the path or the trajectory of the dislocation going through the twin boundary. And now we repeat the same thing, but we introduce our kink step defect. This one is actually even smaller than the one I presented before. But it happens that the dislocation hits the defect directly. And what it shows is the defect will totally absorb that dislocation and now form three dislocations that cross-slip along the twin plane. And so it's an absorption mechanism versus a transmission. And in terms of mechanical property and especially ductility, this produce very different results, all right? Just by using one defect in the simulation. And we look at different cases. And so this one, for instance, is a dislocation, a screw dislocation that intersects an entire kink, but at 60 degrees, all right? And so what you find in the movie here is this dislocation has a very hard time to slip to the next grain, okay? So it's really being pined by that kink defect along the twin boundary. So bottom line, defects play a very important role in the mechanics of those twin boundaries. So this was about copper. Now let me talk about nanotwin silver. So silver, for the reason I explained, is very attractive because it has a very high electrical conductivity. And so those solid boundaries, in general, they do not reduce the electrical conductivity. But by adding twin, we can improve the strength. So we maintain the electrical conductivity, but without changing the strength. And so these are just results obtained from different groups, including us here, of nanotwin silver. But the problem with nanotwin silver is you can use the best technique, the best approach you want. You never get down to a grain size that's on the order of 100 or 200 nanometers. And a twin spacing on the order of 7 to 8 nanometers. And that's a kind of a problem because all the interesting mechanics happens just below that limit. The problem is we cannot make those materials to look at them fundamentally, right? And so the grain size is extremely important in this problem. If you're able to control the grain size, reduce the grain size, then you can expect to achieve smaller twins, all right? And so, for instance, theoretically, you can use a theory for dislocation nucleation from stress concentration at grain boundaries. And so just using this type of theory, first, if you use finite element modeling, you can predict what will be the stress concentration to pass to nucleate a new dislocation here. Using this approach is purely continuum approach. We see that the stress concentration scales as square root of lambda over d. That's correlated to an all-patch behavior. And that corresponds to hardening. So if I decrease the twin size, I will actually affect the behavior and harden the material. So the smaller the twin size, the actually smaller or larger the hardening we obtain. And then we can take a different approach in simulation. We can simulate by atomistic simulation the system. This is actually based on the proposal by Gao and others in Nature. And in this case, the stress concentration is just all the different atomic strain that changes in the grain boundary. And so they develop a theory, but that explains actually that in this case, as you decrease the twin size, you will get softening, okay? But what I want to emphasize here is in both cases, you see that whether you have hardening or softening, the twin size is important, but also the grain size. So if you can change the grain size and the twin size, then you can change the behavior here. The thing is, it's not done experimentally very easily, right? So what my friends came up with at Lawrence Livermore and Ames lab is, well, we're going to dope this material with copper, but very small amount of copper, so it does not affect at all the electrical conductivity. It doesn't change the macrostructure, but it's just there to bind the grain boundary, all right? And so they have obtained very dramatic result with that. By adding less than 1% of copper to silver, they were able to produce film with a twin size of 3.6 nanometer and a grain size of 15 nanometers, which is like almost by a factor of 4 smaller than what has been shown before. And we characterize them mechanically. And we find the strength to be much higher than any previous nanotwin silver film. Okay, so this is very exciting. And so we use atomistic simulation. In this case, we need to use very large-scale simulation that contains like almost 50 million atoms, and that's pretty big. So we need to use supercomputers with 800 CPUs and so on to run this simulation. And so one simulation we did here is we simulate the segregation of copper to the interfaces. All right. So it's called hybrid Monte Carlo molecular dynamics simulation. And so we can simulate the segregation of the solute atom inside the structure. And what we find is very interesting. As predicted, we find that the grain boundaries attract the copper. So that explains why the grain size remains small and they bind the boundary. But what's very new here is these tiny defects along the twin boundaries are also attracting the solute element. And so we can imagine that now we have a new hypothesis that is both the grain boundaries and the defect on the twin boundaries are strengthened by the doping. and therefore result is in this hardening in the behavior. Okay, so these are things that we are exploring right now in our group. All right, so now let me go to the second part of the talk. So fortunately, twin boundaries are not always imperfect. All right, and so one area where we can make perfect twin boundaries is by shrinking the size of the material. We make nanowires, and the wires are so small that even if one defect happens to form on a twin boundary, the surface nearby would just absorb it right away. All right, so we can make nanowires with perfect twin boundaries, and we look at this with the case of twin gold nanowires. And again, it's a work with my colleague at the University of Pittsburgh, where we compare high-resolution TM experiments to the simulation. So let me show you first the case when we have a nanowire, and we will try to understand the strength of these wires. And it contains just a few twins that are spaced by more than 6 or 7 nanometers. So let's see the experiment, okay, in situ. So what the experiment shows is there is extensive plasticity located between two twin boundaries, right? And so you can extend this wire, okay? And so the difference in contrast you see in the video represents the nucleation of dislocation from the free surface, right? Okay, at the same time, we perform atomistic simulation, and they actually describe exactly the same behavior. So it's one case where we have perfect agreement between the simulation and the experiment. And the reason for that is because the nanowires are so small, we can model exactly the same thing in simulation. We don't need a lot of resources to do this simulation. So that shows clearly some large plasticity. And again, this is well established. This plasticity results from the nucleation of surface dislocation. So there's nothing new. So now what we did is we look at another type of wire, but these are made by solution process synthesis, and they do form a very high density of twins. So we call this the ultra high density twin, and it's quite amazing. The average twin spacing is just 7 angstrom. All right, it's the minimum limit you can have between two twin boundaries. Okay, that's how stable and perfect they are in this scale. And so we repeated the same experiment. And first, let me show you the difference in mechanical behavior. So the green line represents a single gold wire that do not contain any twin, and it's very ductile. And it's a stress and strain. You have a strength here and very ductile. You add some twins to it, you increase the strength, and the ductility is actually even better. Right? That's the first video. Now those ultra high density twins, see suddenly we achieve very, very high stress, but no ductility at all. So we go from a total ductile to brittle transition. And we even tested nanowires that contain segment of ultra high twins and segment of low density twins, and the behavior is in between. All right? And so I have to point out this is gold, and gold is probably the softest metal you can find. And you look at the value of stress we measure in situ on the order of the best ultra high strength material we have. So gold turns into an ultra high strength material on the nanoscale. That's how dramatic the change is. So these materials are brittle, and this is obvious when we look at the simulation. So this is the in situ experiment. You see all the twins here playing, and we're not gonna see a lot of plasticity here. It's almost a brittle-like behavior. Boom, see here, it just broke in half. But very surprisingly, there's a tip that's formed that does not twin at all. Okay, and then we do the simulation, and the same behavior happens in the simulation. So it's not just an experimental artifact. We reproduce that in simulation. Okay, it's something more fundamental. So the advantage of using simulation here is we can look at the deformation mechanism on an atomic scale and understand why they behave like this. And that's what we did here. And what we discover is when the twin size is very small, you start to form homogeneous nucleation inside the wire, which no longer nucleate from the surface. And so that totally changed the mechanics of the material. In particular, this series of events shows the nucleation of those homogeneous dislocation forming a shear band, and then a dead twin tip, and like what the experiment was showing. Okay, so that's one advantage. Of course, we wanted to make sure everything was consistent in the experiment, so we were able to reproduce many tests showing distinctive behaviors in the experiment, and we plotted our result against the literature result for gold, and I believe we still have the world record in the strength of gold with this type of design, having nanowires with twin boundaries. So that was the discovery. So overall, we call this behavior, you see, we have small wires are here, bulk wires are here. And so this trend, typically in the literature, as a name, we call this the smaller is stronger trend, okay? But I have to say also that it's not only stronger, it's also more brittle. And again, we don't like brittle parts, right, for engineering. So it's not totally ideal. It's a near ideal strength, but they are very brittle. And so I will come in the last part of my presentation, going back to the silver nanowires. And so this is a more recent study we concluded this year that shows that these silver nanowires, they actually can achieve both ideal strength and very large ductility and superplasticity if you define properly their size. So here's the problem. In the case of silver nanowires, the literature is in a good agreement and says that when your wire is more than 14 nanometers in diameter, it follows the same smaller is stronger trend, and the strength is very high. Okay, so we know that from experiment and both simulation. When the wires are very small or you have nanoparticle, you start to observe this exotic behavior, the liquid-like behavior, when they become very small. And the reason is because atoms on the surface diffuse easily and almost represent some sort of a melting on the surface. And so they behave more like a liquid behavior. The thing is, between 10 nanometer and 14 nanometer, there was a gap in knowledge. All right, nobody really tested wires between the two. So the question is, hey, if there is such a dramatic change from strong to liquid-like behavior, maybe somewhere in between, we could have both behaviors matching at a specific diameter. And so what we did is we focused our attention to the mechanical behavior of wires exactly within this range and see if we could achieve new properties. Of course, mechanically, it's very hard to test this crystal. It's just an example of how it's done here. You need to attach a particle to a probe, which is approach and stick by cold welding to a substrate on the other side. You really need to have a talented researcher and graduate student to do this, so it's really tedious work. And then on our side, we do molecular dynamics simulation. I would have to say it's a little bit easier for us because we can design the wire with steps and so on, and we can measure the ductility of the material. Now, you notice on it I highlighted some atoms in red color. So these are just used as markers to see what's going on the surface of the crystals. So if any diffusion happens, you'll see those atoms will start to dance on the surface of the nanowire. In this example, it was not the case. Those bands remain just deformed by crystal slip. Right? So let me show you some experimental results. First, in the case of platinum, we wanted to compare two metals. So we have silver and platinum. Now, if you take bulk silver and platinum, they pretty much have the same type of ductility, right? They have largely ductile metals. Well, in this case, for platinum, when you use a platinum nanowire or nanocrystal, it's actually pretty brittle. It has a shear localization and necking. And so the ductility is relatively limited to just 10-20%, which is low for this type of material. So you'll see that in the video here. So it's a high-resolution TM video in situ where we pull the crystal. And we see this shear band, which is characteristic of a relatively brittle behavior. So platinum follows what we would expect for gold, for instance. Okay. And now here comes the silver one. So silver, we have in this example 2 different diameters. So I want to show that this works at least in this range, 28 nanometers and 59 nanometers. In this one, you see clearly that we can extend this wire by nearly more than 150% without breaking the wire, okay? And then the video would be even more obvious. We keep pulling on this silver crystal, and it just never breaks. We pull, and so the behavior is totally different from platinum. It's actually has the ability to extend superplastic deformation to up to more than 100%. Right? Never breaks. Now, when you look carefully, crystal slip is still present in this wire. So it's not like the liquid lag behavior. There is crystal slip in there, but also we have high plasticity. So the students repeated this many times, and so we see clearly that silver is much more superplastic in this range of diameters than platinum. This represents the ductility before we observe a neck in the wires. And we achieve values on the other 100%, okay? And this is very clear that silver is a much better material to resist the strain in this application. But up to a certain limit, you see below 15 nanometers, the silver nanowire will find a significant softening. And actually that made sense based on the observation we made in the microscope. Below 15 nanometers, basically, without even applying any stress, this crystal would just deform like the liquid lag behavior. We don't even apply any stress here. The neck occurs naturally by diffusion from the surface and break that junction. Right? So that only happens when your crystal is less than 15 nanometers. But this range here, which was totally unknown so far, shows very different behavior. Right? So the advantage of using the experiment is we can really now we're at the point where we can look at the atom dynamics on the surface of the wires, and that explains a lot, especially trying to understand the difference in mechanical behavior. So basically what you will see here are single crystal slip events, so some surface dislocation. And each time you nucleate a dislocation, there's a tiny atomic step that forms on the surface. And so we were able to capture the dynamics of that step in almost real time. There's about half a second of time between each snapshot, so it's pretty slow. But you'll see on the movie here that process. So this is very fast dislocation nucleation, so we didn't see the nucleation. You see the steps here that nucleate, like here's a dislocation there, and they form steps, and now those steps are just migrating along this surface. So that suggests here that it's not only crystal slip, it's not just pure diffusion. It looks like it's an interplay. There's crystal slip, and there's some diffusion happening at the same time. All right? So that's the behavior. Now, to verify that, we conducted some atomistic simulation. And so the way we do that in atomistic simulation, we change the temperature to control the surface diffusion. Right? Because it's very hard. The time scale is so short in simulation to simulate diffusion. So here there's high temperature and slow strain rate. And you see the atoms here get diffused more easily on the surface. And now the case at the bottom here is the same material, same model, but now I reduce the temperature and I increase the strain rate by a factor of 10. And so here there's no time for atoms to diffuse on the surface. All right? And what we find here is this case as necking relatively early in the simulation, while when we allow for diffusion on the surface, this wire keeps elongating to 100% and more in simulation. And then again, the advantage of using atomistic simulation, we can look at the detail. And the detail shows this. When you allow for diffusion, there is definitely an absence of the steps here that form. So you see a lot of deformation localized on the surface that is consistent with a diffusion or atom diffusion on the surface that coincide with the nucleation of the dislocation. When we reduce the temperature, of course, we prevent surface diffusion, In this case, we see a lot more slip band, and these slip bands are the cause for stress concentration that accelerate the nicking of the material. Another thing, again, it's very hard to compare experiment and simulation because the strain rate between the two is about a factor of 10 order of magnitude. And so you cannot just say, what happened at high strain rate is the same at low strain rate. But still, we can compare the behaviors. And so something comparable we found is in the in situ TM experiment. By reducing the strain rate, we find a dependence on the ductility that increase. And that's totally abnormal. Usually, when you decrease the strain rate, you will break these wires faster. The ductility should drop. And that's not what the experiment shows here. And so when we did the simulation, we observed exactly the same phenomenon, which is when we allow for surface diffusion, there is clearly an inverse dependence, a negative dependence. When we stop surface diffusion by decreasing the temperature or use platinum, okay, then we have the standard dependence. So that shows clearly there is an interplay between the plasticity and the surface diffusion. Right? So just one of the last slides I want to show here is we came up with a mechanism to explain this behavior. And so the question is the crystal slip becoming before diffusion, or is diffusion causing crystal slip? All right? Because that's important to know. In general, diffusion can promote defect and dislocation. It's possible from grain boundaries. But the opposite was never observed. And in this case, we show that it is actually the crystal slip that comes first, and that will activate surface creep. All right? So there's a dislocation here that nucleated form a step, and then that step in the next sequence moves and diffuses on the atomic scale. In this case, there's another step here that forms, and this will form. So we came up with a model that explained this observation. On the atomic scale, which is why my talk is entitled Small Scale Mechanics, is because you need to really be very careful about the atomic scale mechanics happening on surfaces or interfaces. In this example, a dislocation nucleates, leaves a step. It's just one atomic layer high, but locally will change the chemical potential along the surface. So the material naturally will produce diffusion to reduce the chemical potential locally by displacing these steps near a curved feature on the wire. Okay, and so that's consistent with the observation here. Okay, so we call this a slip-activated surface creep mechanism, which was never observed before. And the last aspect I want to emphasize is these materials, the silver nanowires, can be superplastic. What about their strength? So we measure directly from the lattice strain how much strain it takes to nucleate two dislocations. So from that, we can estimate the elastic limit of the wires. And we find the elastic limit to be on the order of 3%, which, using the Young's modulus, represent about 2.8 gigapascal. And that is exactly very close to the ideal strength for silver. All right, so not only they can be superplastic, but when they do this process, they are also near the ideal theoretical strength, which is kind of amazing. So very promising material. And my last slide today is just to explain why platinum didn't behave like this. And the main reason is because with platinum, in simulation, we see here surface diffusion is very limited when you look at you compare the same temperature, because the melting of platinum is much higher than silver, okay, the melting point. So at the same temperature, you experience much less surface diffusion with platinum. And the surface diffusion is critical to make this process happen. If you do not allow for the step to diffuse, then you will create a shear band. And it's even shown in the tip blunting experiment. So here it's a nanowire that's broken to make a sharp tip. And what we do is we look at the radius. So basically the tip retracts and it will form a radius. It becomes at equilibrium. And so basically you can measure the diffusivity by just measuring the radius. And so from this experiment, we show that the fact that it's blunt here, more in silver than platinum, is another evidence that the surface diffusion in silver is very important compared to platinum. And that's the source of this difference in mechanical behavior. Okay? All right, so that was the end of the story. So just to conclude this presentation, I think there are three important things, general things that are important to remember here. Nature of collaborative effort is critical in nanoscience. So here we use integrated experimental and computational studies which have enabled new discoveries in the fracture and plasticity of nanoscale metals. Again, it's because, you know, one day I was sitting next to these people in the classroom when I was a postdoc or graduate student that were able to make these discoveries much later. So very important to network. Then this enables new knowledge. We find new mechanical behavior associated with size effect in nanoscale metals. So here controlling the size changed the mechanical behavior. And of course, this is very fundamental, but there are real world applications for this. If we can really change or find the size of material on atomic scale to control their mechanical behavior, so this gives us some guidelines to design new material, especially energy material for the future. Okay? And so I have to thank the people who helped me with that type of studies. These are my students and postdoc at University of Vermont, so they are not far from here. Involved in the atomistic simulation, or we're also trying to make those silver nanowires. And here in color, these are the people who helped me with the experiment, so I'm definitely not alone in this work. It takes a lot of effort, and so I have to acknowledge greatly their contribution here. And of course, my sponsors, NSF and DOE, and ICSID, if you are a graduate student interested in computational material science, you do not need to buy a supercomputer. These are extremely expensive. What you do is you submit a proposal. The deadline is January 15. It's actually on Sunday, so you still have time. And it's a 10-page proposal, so you can work tomorrow, and by Sunday it's going to be done. And you get access to the best supercomputer in the world. You know, that's how it works. So you don't need to buy a supercomputer to do computational research and atomistic simulation. So that's definitely a resource I recommend because it's been very valuable for our research. Thank you. So I didn't call this. It was the publication in Nature Materials. So they call this a liquid lag behavior. But it means that if I show the first slide, they look like they can be deformed like liquids. So basically, when you stretch them, so the experiment is this. They have a particle, they come in contact, and so it forms some sort of a meniscus. And then they pull, and when they pull, that particle comes back naturally with no force. To like the visual appearance is yes. And so, and it's not my work. I have to. This is the work here. See, that video shows it in particular. See this one, yeah. And so it looks like it, but it's not. In reality, what happened is the particle remains crystalline, but the surface is turning into a melting layer.
You're attributing this behavior to some kind of surface defect.
Yes.
Combined with the dislocation.
No, so in this case, there's no dislocation. Yeah, but in my case, when the diameter is larger, yes, the dislocation will initiate the surface diffusion.
If you coated your silver with platinum,
Mm-hmm.
what would happen?
It's a good question. It's an excellent question because maybe there's a way to, if we coat silver by a platinum layer, we may prevent surface diffusion. Or maybe we can think of other system where we could maybe enhance the surface diffusion. I don't know.
True, that should happen.
Yeah,
What you tell us is true, that should happen.
that should happen. Yeah.
Well, when you're comparing platinum and silver, they're not the equivalent fraction to the melting point. Do you have the comparison that equal fraction to the melting point?
So yeah, so their melting point is different. So silver is about 1250 Kelvin and platinum is 1800 Kelvin.
Yeah.
So what we did, so there are two ways we can do this. It was actually a remark from the reviewer when he got accepted, and it was a point of debate. So there are two ways you can do this study. You can use the same homologous temperature and compare the behavior, or you keep the temperature constant, but then in this case, the homologous temperature are different. And so what we did here is we tried to match the experiment. Unfortunately, the experiment, we don't have a high temperature in situ TM, so everything was done at the same temperature, at room temperature. And so if we were comparing simulation at same homologous temperature, we will have to use different temperatures. You see what I mean? So the goal, when we try to compare what happened in the simulation and the experiment, was to keep the temperature constant. But that means the homologous temperature are different. Of course, we can always diffuse atoms on the surface of platinum if we increase the temperature. All right? But then that's not what we did in the experiment. In the experiment, we kept all the temperature constant.
But you also have an effect on your surfaces that the tendency to be flat or rough should depend on temperature, shouldn't it? On the atomic.
Absolutely. So the comment is the surface morphology changes with the temperature, and in fact, what makes the morphology change are actually those crystal slip. They form steps, and you see the wire, which is initially circular, is no longer circular after a few %. And so there is some roughness just from the plasticity that forms at this scale. And so the diffusion here is just there to smooth out the defects, right? If you do not allow for surface diffusion of atoms, the steps are going to stay there and form a stress concentration, right? So that's what the atomistic simulation showed is, yes, it's an interplay between the roughness, the crystal slip, and the surface diffusion. You need to have plasticity and diffusion. And what we show is it is the plasticity that initiates that diffusion on the surface. If you have a nanowire that's perfectly smooth, perfectly straight, you will not see any surface diffusion, and this effect will not happen. You have to have some defect on the surface. The steps need to be present. Okay. I hope I addressed your question.
So a majority of the molecular dynamics that we see rely on like the time scale, kind of. You look at like strain rate and all, like the kinetics of this location of like deformation. But like, have you actually looked at like how molecular dynamic time compare with like an actual time? For example, can you look at like how this location travel through like a crystal? Does it make sense that it can travel at this speed?
So the question is about the difference in time scale between the atomistic simulation and the experiment, and especially with regard to deformation mechanism like dislocation propagation. So fortunately, dislocation travel very fast in a crystal, which is why it's very hard to see in the experiment. You don't really see the dislocation. You see some contrast. But there's no way with current technology to capture the event of nucleation propagation within an ultra-thin nanowire. In atomistic simulation, the reason why there's a benefit is we can take snapshots on the order of picoseconds, right? And so like we can take 1,000 snapshots within 1 nanosecond, and typically your dislocation nucleates, propagates, and disappear on the other surface in maybe 5 picoseconds, right? But we can capture that in the simulation, right? That's the big advantage. Still, to achieve that, you need to, in simulation, deform the wire with a strain rate that is 10 order of magnitude larger than in experiment. So can we match the strain rate in experiment and simulation? It may be possible, but it will require maybe a PhD student who wants to develop that. That will make a huge progress in this area, okay? That's not what we did here. There are techniques to accelerate the molecular dynamics to strain rates on the order of microseconds. So this simulation represents nanoseconds of deformation. In experiment, there are seconds of deformation, or on the order of seconds. So there are methods to accelerate the molecular dynamics on the order of microseconds. It's maybe the best you can do. And unfortunately, that requires a lot of resources as well. All right. So you can use the fastest supercomputer right now with all the computing, the CPU you want on it. You will never achieve the same than in experiment. So maybe in the future, but not now.